welcome to this special edition of Washington Talk. I'm Eun-jung Cho. Two of America's closest allies in Asia, Japan and South Korea, are locked in an escalating trade dispute. This is the latest flare-up in decades of tensions over history between the neighboring countries.
輸出管理の土台となる信頼関係が失われてきたのも事実であります。
일본 측의 조치 철회와 양국 간의 성의 있는 협의를 촉구합니다.
Japan has some things that South Korea wants, and he asked me to get involved. So maybe if they would both want me to, I'll be.
In the studio with me today, Mr. Mark Tokola, Vice President of the Korea Economic Institute of America. Mr. Tokola had served as Deputy Chief of Mission at the American Embassy in Seoul. Also joining me, Ambassador James Zumwalt, CEO of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, USA. Ambassador Zumwalt was Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for East Asian Affairs and was responsible for policy toward Japan and Korea. And our Mr. Scott Snyder, Director of U.S.-Korea Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. Mr. Snyder co-authored the Japan-South Korea Identity Clash, East Asian Security, and the United States. Welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Now, Ambassador, let me begin with you. So the tensions flared up earlier this month when Japan announced export restrictions on 3 chemical items to South Korea and also warned that it might remove South Korea from trade whitelist. So why does Japan all of a sudden have national security concerns regarding trade with South Korea?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for the invitation to this show. I look forward to talking about 2 important American allies. I think the United States was surprised by Japan's action because until now, Japan has not used national security issues as a reason to impose trade restrictions. But I also think that the criticism of this action in Washington has been muted because people in Washington are also concerned by actions the Moon government has taken, which have reduced the friendship or increased tensions between Japan and Korea. And the main goal, I think, for the United States is to see an improvement in relations between our 2 allies. Mm-hmm.
Mr. Snyder, why do you think Prime Minister Abe mentioned the broken trust between Japan and South Korea?
I think it's because from Prime Minister Abe's perspective, that is the core issue. He has actually lost faith in the ability of the South Korean government, from his perspective, to keep promises. And of course, the reason for that is that Prime Minister Abe made a deal with then President Park over comfort women issues that has not been honored in the Moon administration. So I think it's understandable why Prime Minister Abe sees it that way. At the same time, President Moon started by trying to pursue a 2-track policy, separating history issues from future issues. But over the course of implementation, he's actually gotten trapped in the same box that had existed that President Park had faced in trying to manage relations with Japan.
Mm-hmm. Mr. Tokola, so how is Japan's actions being received in Seoul? And South Korea says that Japan is retaliating because of the historical issues. So if this is the root reason, the core reason, then is South Korea taking any actions to address these differences over history?
Yeah, I think there was surprise and consternation in Seoul that Japan took this rather dramatic trade action, which is unprecedented. It's unusual, highly, for a country to take steps to inhibit exports to South Korea based on this national security grounds. I've not heard anyone make a plausible case that the reason for the action is what Japan says it is, that it's actually about national security. It seems clear it is about history.
So if that is the reason why there is a tension, then is South Korea taking any actions to address the historical issues with Japan diplomatically?
I believe they are. I think there's been an effort by the Moon administration to try to reach out to Japan, to have a discussion among the companies involved in the forced labor issues. That's not been received well so far. I think there's also a deeper reason that this is a problem in that the Koreans perceive that Japan's been taking backward steps on its recognition of the historical issues under the Abe administration.
So how is the perception from Japan over this historical dispute with Korea?
I think from Japan's perspective, what they would like to do is focus on the big security challenge in the region, which is North Korea and the threat that North Korea poses to other countries in the region. And so they believe that this steps that the Moon administration has taken, which have damaged bilateral relations, have really undermined Japan's own national security interests. So I think there is a desire to improve relations and find some off-ramps or ways of improving the situation.
Yeah, maybe I should add, too, that these are not steps taken by the Moon administration. They're steps been taken in the South Korean court system. So the cases about forced labor are not new. The Supreme Court of Korea didn't make this decision ill-founded or hastily. These are cases that have been argued for over 10 years in South Korean courts. Busan Court, the Seoul Court, there have been appeals courts. There have been decisions going both ways within the court system. It's finally worked its way up to the Supreme Court after 10 years. So this is not a new situation.
So this is the position of the South Korean government, but isn't this also, Mr. Snyder, a diplomatic issue? Can it only be confined to legalistic issues?
Well, it's absolutely become a diplomatic and political issue. I don't think that the issue can be solved by purely legal means. And so one of the challenges is that both sides have put themselves into a box because basically their preferred way of framing the issue dictates the way they think about how they want to engage with the other side. Japan had suggested arbitration based on a gap in understanding about the contents of the Normalization Treaty of 1965 between Japan and South Korea. But the South Korean side wants to pursue this in a different way because they see Japan's perceived lack of forthcomingness on the history issue as the core question. And so they want to deal with it outside of the question of the validity of the 65 treaty.
And Ambassador, why was a Supreme Court's decision to allow the individuals to pursue reparation from Japanese companies, why was this decision so explosive in Japan?
Well, first of all, the economic relationship between Japan and the Republic of Korea has been one of the positive aspects of relations. Both countries have benefited from the ability to invest in each other's economies, to export and trade back and forth. So that's been one of the positive aspects of Japan-Korea relations. And these actions, of course, have called into question whether there is a basis for continuing to make investments in the other economy if those investments could be at risk because of domestic court challenges. So that's one of the very unfortunate aspects of this relationship, is that one of the pillars of supporting the relationship has now been damaged.
Yeah, well, history is never just in the past. I mean, there's no set number of apologies that put history behind you. You know, you live with history. You have to deal with it all the time. You can't decide it's over. So the answer to historical questions is probably more history. I mean, I think Americans need to show some humility in talking about Korean-Japanese relations, because there's deep historical interaction between the two countries. There's deep legal issues involved. So we should be careful not to be too prescriptive or judgmental about what's going on. You know, I would say that the 1965 treaty was written at a time when reparations for property were really the big issue at stake. They didn't talk about individual harm in those days. That came up more in the 1990s. So the 65 treaty doesn't deal with that well, and the issue of forced labor being settled in courts is even going on in the United States now. It's not settled law. So there's legal aspects that need to be done along diplomatic aspects. It's not one or the other, but you can't dismiss the legal arguments.
I would agree that there are legal issues, but at this stage, there also are incredibly important political and security issues. And from the perspective of the United States, we would very much like to see an improvement in Japan-Korea relations, because this downturn in the relationship has damaged our interests, and I think it's also damaged Japanese and Korean interests as well. On the other hand, I think it is important for the United States to play a role in trying to stop the continued deterioration of the relations between Japan and Korea, because it really fundamentally damages our interests and their interests.
And Mr. Snyder, what is the current position of the Trump administration? South Korea strongly wants U.S. involvement, and President Trump said U.S. will get involved if the two parties want the U.S. involvement. So what is the current position?
I think the administration has expressed a hands-off approach to getting involved in between Japan and South Korea. Although, as you mentioned, President Trump has kind of volunteered himself as a potential mediator between the two sides. And so I think that historically what we've seen is that the United States has gotten involved behind the scenes earlier in terms of kind of whispering into the ear of Japan and South Korea, respectively. And this time, I think the Trump administration has been a little bit late to that game. And that, I think, has made the situation worse. But now we're getting to a point where the actions on both sides are impinging on U.S. critical interests related to the security architecture in the region. And so I think that the U.S. is going to find itself having to engage in a more active way in trying to facilitate and create an environment for Japan and South Korea to deal with this issue more constructively.
Mm-hmm. And Ambassador, is it difficult for the United States to take sides between the two very close friends?
I don't think the United States will take sides. And that's one concern when one party or the other asks for the United States to be involved. What they're really asking for is, please take our side. And the United States will not do that because we have two allies, both of whom are very important. So I think if the United States were to get involved, there'll be some tough messaging to both parties behind the scenes. Perhaps another thing the United States could do is serve as a convening entity, perhaps to propose some kind of trilateral meeting where we can again focus on critical issues where we all share common interests, such as what to do about North Korea.
Mm-hmm. So South Korea has been asking for U.S. mediation, but U.S. is not really stepping into this issue as of now. So is there any kind of frustration from Seoul?
I think there's a bit. I think they expected for more. I'm not sure the U.S. can mediate this situation. They can provide good offices. And I personally think the U.S. should be more assertive in trying to bring the three sides together to have a conversation. That'd be useful. I think one of the problems now is that in the past, individual South Korean and Japanese political leaders knew each other better. They were able to talk kind of behind the scenes. And I don't see those relationships existing today between Seoul and Tokyo, which makes the U.S. role probably more important than it was in the past.
Mm-hmm. And Ambassador, in the past, the cool down factor were the businesses of the two countries who wanted trade with each other. But currently, South Korean government, the South Korean court allowed individuals to sue Japanese companies. So what would be the sentiment among Japanese companies to get involved and just cool things down?
Well, I think that is an issue that if investors are not confident that their investment is secure, and if they feel there's a risk of expropriation of their property, it will result in a decline in new investment into Korea. Likewise, Japanese companies that want to sell products to Korean customers are concerned that these steps the Japanese government is taking might have an impact on their business. So I do think the business communities on both sides, and to be honest, the American business community, whose interests are also affected, can be involved in the sense of talking to their governments and encouraging that both sides refrain from steps that really further damage our very positive economic ties.
Mm-hmm.
I would just add that I think that the U.S. does not want to see an economic decoupling between Japan and South Korea. And where I would focus attention is that means that actions against Japanese companies could encourage that, but at the same time, these export control restrictions also encourage that. And so I see that both of those sorts of actions as actions that are against the interests of the United States.
Mm-hmm. We'll take a brief video break and continue with our discussion.
Mm-hmm.
현재 한미 군사 당국은 상세한 정보를 공유하면서 정밀 분석 중입니다.
As Japan and South Korea spar over trade and history, North Korea fires ballistic missiles, and Russia and China invade Seoul's airspace. Now, Ambassador, North Korea fired 2 ballistic missiles, and President Trump said North Korea didn't test any missiles except for smaller ones. And South Korea and Japan says that their security has not been harmed by these ballistic missiles. So what do you make of these reactions from the 3 countries, especially when South Korea and Japan are within range of North Korean ballistic missiles?
I think all 3 countries would like to give diplomacy a chance, and I think their judgment was if they react more strongly to this step, that would reduce the likelihood of some further engagement between the United States and North Korea. So for the time being, I think all sides, or all those 3 countries, are trying to not elevate this problem any further.
So, Mr. Snyder, North Korea issued a statement saying that this is a warning against South Korea's warmongers bringing in equipment from outside and doing joint drills with the United States. So, do you think North Korea is trying to drive a wedge between U.S. and South Korea at this time? And especially when Japan-South Korean ties are very weak at the time, how do you think North Korea will try to take advantage of this situation?
I do believe that it's very interesting that the North Koreans have come out so publicly in attacking South Korea on this issue of F-35 imports and blaming South Korean actions for the exercises. And I think in many respects, North Korea has been showing its true colors since the DMZ meeting, where Moon Jae-in was kind of reduced to the role of butler while Trump and Kim met. And this is part of North Korea's Uri Minjok-Kiri's strategy because they've been criticizing South Korea for not being more active in taking the North Korean side. And so frankly, I think that it's a bad sign for the possibility of a positive outcome in diplomatic dialogue because the North Koreans are pursuing the same kinds of tactics we've seen before. We don't see them turning a new page.
Mr. Tokola, right after the North Korean missile launch, Japan, South Korea, and United States shared intelligence. South Korea, 청와대 hinted that it may terminate GSOMIA in reaction to Japan's actions. So is this a prudent way of dealing with things?
Well, I think in the same way that Japan resorted to trade actions to deal with frustrations it was having about the forced labor cases, I think South Korea is discussing GSOMIA because it doesn't have a lot of other things it can do to vent its frustration. So GSOMIA should not be the topic on the table because of the other tensions between Japan and Korea. It's a useful agreement for all 3 countries. It should continue. It wouldn't be catastrophic if it ended because cooperation would continue anyway, but it would make it more inefficient to share intelligence.
And Mr. Snyder, doesn't South Korea benefit a lot from GSOMIA?
I think South Korea does benefit from GSOMIA. I mean, if we just go back and look at the history of North Korean missile tests, that's been the thing that has driven greater intelligence sharing and cooperation over the course of the years. And so now South Korea has a system where it can watch what is happening. The US and Japan are also doing that. And it's the coordination of sharing of intelligence about those tests that really form the backbone of support for an understanding and a proper security response to these sorts of actions by North Korea.
And if I could just add another example of a benefit to all 3 from intelligence sharing are the recent Chinese and Russian incursions of aircraft. And one of the key things intelligence sharing can help with is awareness of the maritime and atmospheric domains. And I think this incident showcased how important it is for South Korea and Japan and the United States to continue sharing intelligence efficiently, which means very quickly. So if South Korea were to decide to terminate its bilateral GSOMIA agreement with Japan, that would really damage the United States' interests in the region as well. And I'm sure that there'll be some very serious discussions with the Republic of Korea to not take steps that damage our security relationships because of poor Japan-Korea relations.
And Ambassador, during that military drill between Russia and China, Russian planes invaded over the airspace of Tokto and Takeshima, and Japan lodged warning against South Korea for firing to those Russian planes. Was this the right time to go on with this territorial dispute?
Yes, unfortunately, there is a territorial dispute between Japan and South Korea over these islands. For the record, the United States doesn't take a position on this issue. I think our view is that this issue, while important, is less important than other issues we're facing right now. And so our advice, I think, by our, I mean, the United States government advice to both sides would be, let's put this issue to be resolved later and focus on the more immediate security threats, which really are North Korean actions in the region, and also the threats of incursions from China and Russia.
If I could add, essentially, if the aim of the Russian and Chinese air forces was to show the wedge between, or the difference between Korea and Japan, it actually didn't work. I mean, on the whole, Japan and Korea cooperate very well in dealing with that incident, and it showed that they do have common interest and will defend their common interest.
I think Japan's response was inevitable, but it was also telling because it was the South Korean aircraft that was actually responding, because South Korea has effective occupation. And so, this particular issue, it's really, in a way, Japan is asking for an additional problem, because Japan also has to worry about airspace around the Senkakus, Diaoyutais, and the northern territories as well. And those are areas where Japan has found itself under stress, trying to scramble and to defend airspace against incursions separately from the Russians and the Chinese, respectively.
And Mr. Snyder, we're looking at the Trilateral alliance in Northeast Asia, and there is an informal maritime coalition, the Quad, United States, Japan, Australia, and India in that group. So how is South Korea participating in this free and open Indo-Pacific strategy?
It's very interesting. This is an example of why the Japan-Korea trade issues are ill-timed, because the U.S. finally got a public commitment from President Moon during the G20 to participate more actively in the free and open Indo-Pacific. And yet, if Japan and South Korea are having trouble getting along, that's going to be a break or a deterrent on finding ways to involve South Korea in that broader network. And yet, from a U.S. perspective, as we look at the region as a whole, it's critical for us to see our allies joining with us as we think about U.S. strategy in the Indo-Pacific.
And if I could just add, I mean, this is a good example of where Japanese and Korean interests coincide. Both Japan and Korea import a lot of petroleum products from the Middle East. A lot of that petroleum goes through the Persian Gulf. So ensuring free flow of maritime traffic is in both countries' fundamental interests. So this perhaps is a good area where we can showcase some of our common interests and work together to protect those interests.
And the U.S. Indo-Pacific strategy is premised on the idea that the allies in the Pacific will have closer cooperation among themselves. It won't be the old hub and spoke system between Washington and capitals individually. So that's why it's important for the United States, in part, that Japan and Korea cooperate well.
I'm running out of time, but I just want to briefly, if all of you could come up with some kind of resolution. How can we come up with resolutions?
Yeah, I don't think we resolve it. I think we manage it. I mean, what I would like to see is maybe for the South Korean government to emphasize more the common interests that they do have with Japan, to tell the South Korean public that the two countries need to manage their relationship.
Ambassador?
My advice to the United States government is to get involved and to talk with both sides with two short-term goals. One is a freeze for freeze, or a ceasefire, where both political leadership and both parties agree, let's not take further steps that make the situation worse. And secondly, to make some political announcements that good relations between Japan and Korea are desirable, and that might send some signals to others in the government then to begin to address many of these issues. I don't think resolution in the short term is an achievable goal, but we can certainly manage the problem and certainly not make it worse.
I fully support the freeze for freeze as a first step towards stabilizing the situation. But the longer term goal for the United States is basically to help South Korea and Japan to get out of their respective boxes that they have put themselves into and to move into the U.S. box that is defined by the security environment and architecture that the U.S. has created that helps to stabilize the region.
Well, that's all the time we have for this week. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
And this was Washington Talk from the Voice of America, and I'm Eun-Jung Cho. Join us next week for more analysis on North Korea and the region.